Fora TV. The world is thinking.
To outsiders, Pitcairn appeared to be an idyllic place, an ideal society, a little utopia. And the island's colourful history and its exotic location only added to its allure. The Pitcairners received a stream of gifts from well-wishers, including Queen Victoria. Then, in 1876, they converted en masse to Seventh-day Adventism. The American-based church was delighted by this coup, and from then on, and until very recently, it promoted Pitcairn throughout the world as a model Christian community. And that was how the island was seen throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, even by non-believers. For as the rest of the world shrank thanks to jet travel, Pitcairn remained tantalizingly inaccessible.
Right now, we're hearing from Kathy Marks as she speaks about her book, Pitcairn, Paradise Lost. Kathy was one of a handful of journalists permitted to live on the island while she reported on the Pitcairn trials and witnessed Pitcairn's domestic workings firsthand. Kathy is the Asia-Pacific correspondent for Britain's Independent and has lived in Australia for the last 7 years. Please make her feel welcome. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. In 2004, I spent 6 weeks living in the world's most remote inhabited place, Pitcairn Island. Sorry. Most of you probably know that Pitcairn's the island where Fletcher Christian and his fellow mutineers went to hide after deposing their captain, William Bligh, and commandeering his ship, the Bounty. You may have seen one of the films about the mutiny. 5 films in total were made over the years. I remember watching the one with Mel Gibson not long ago, and it ends with a scene of the English sailors landing on Pitcairn with their Tahitian wives. And until quite recently, no one really knew much about what happened next. Pitcairn's a lump of volcanic rock, about 4.5 kilometres square, perched in the middle of the South Pacific, about midway between New Zealand and Chile. Now, if you look in that top right-hand corner, that's the little dot between Australia and South America. The island's home to just 50 people nowadays, most of them directly descended from the mutineers and still carrying surnames such as Christian. In about 2000, some rather unsavoury stories began to trickle out of Pitcairn. It all began with a 15-year-old schoolgirl who told a visiting English policewoman that she'd been raped by 2 local men. British police began investigating, since Pitcairn's a British colony, and they quickly realised that the problem went beyond this one girl. They crisscrossed the globe, interviewing dozens of women who'd grown up on the island in different eras, and all of those women told the same story. The abuse, it seemed, dated back many generations. Almost every girl who'd lived on Pitcairn had been a victim, and almost every Pitcairn man had been an offender. Eventually, 13 men were charged, and in 2004, seven of them went on trial on the island in a rather ramshackle community hall that hadn't been used as a courthouse for about 30 years. Now, just imagine Pitcairn Island with its towering cliffs and lashing surf and dusty red tracks and everyone getting around on quad bikes. And suddenly, there's lawyers and judges everywhere in polished shoes and long black gowns. And then there's the accused men appearing in court in shorts and t-shirts, usually barefoot. The island's swarming with outsiders. In fact, the place is so crowded that defence lawyers are having to sleep in the jail. This is a jail, by the way, that the men on trial have built themselves, knowing that they might end up in it. I was one of those outsiders. I went to the island to report on the trials for a British newspaper. And during those 6 weeks, I and my colleagues lived right at the heart of the Pitcairn community. There were 6 of us journalists, and we were not welcome visitors. But in a place that small, you can't avoid people. And so every day we'd bump into the accused men and their families. In fact, one of the men, Len Brown, was our next-door neighbour. Now, the islanders were reading our reports on the internet, and they weren't very happy with what they read. So we'd go into the shop, for instance. Pitcairn's only got one little shop, and it opens for an hour 3 times a week. And we'd find ourselves being harangued by people. They'd say to us, "Why are you writing these lies?" And basically, "Why don't you F off our island?" So there were some unpleasant moments and hostile encounters. And meanwhile, in court every day, we were listening to these very harrowing stories of abuse from the victims who were testifying by video link from New Zealand. At the end of the trials, 6 men were found guilty, and I went back home to Australia, but I continued to be fascinated and I suppose haunted by the whole Pitcairn story. I wanted to find out more about this strange little society in the middle of nowhere, how it ticked and how it had gone so badly wrong. I wondered why the abuse had remained hidden for so long, and why it was that many outsiders defended the men. And I asked myself, what did this case tell us about human behaviour, particularly in small, isolated societies? Would we all behave like this if we were left to ourselves, with no one looking over our shoulder? I'm going to talk about 3 key issues today: the Pitcairn myth, the island's extreme isolation, and the silence of all of the adults who had responsibility for Pitcairn over the years. At the time of the mutiny in 1789, most Europeans knew very little about the South Pacific. But from the accounts of the early explorers, it sounded like a tropical paradise. It was all beaches and palm trees and lagoons teeming with fish, and friendly natives with none of the Europeans' sexual hang-ups. One French botanist reported, "The Tahitians know no other god but love. Every day is consecrated to it. The whole island is its temple. All the women are its idols. All the men its worshippers." When William Bligh returned home, having survived the mutiny, he told a tale that made everyone in England sit up. His ship had been seized in the middle of the South Pacific, and the mutineers, he believed, had sailed off to Tahiti, where they'd already spent 6 months and had grown rather enamoured of the local women. Although mutiny was a very serious crime back then, it seemed an incredibly romantic adventure story. And it spawned books and newspaper articles and poems. A London theatre put on a musical called The Calamities of Captain Bligh. Fletcher Christian hadn't gone to Tahiti. With 8 of the other mutineers, he'd fled to Pitcairn, reckoning that the Royal Navy would never find them there. As for the beautiful Tahitian maidens who accompanied the sailors, well, most of them had been kidnapped. And within 10 years of settling on Pitcairn, all but one of the men had killed each other, mainly in fights over women. So it wasn't such a romantic story. It wasn't until nearly 20 years later that the fledgling community on Pitcairn was discovered. An American whaler stumbled across the island by accident and found the one surviving mutineer, John Adams, living there with 9 women and 24 children. These were children who'd been born to him and the other men before they'd been slaughtered. Adams told the ship's captain that after the killings, he learnt to read with a Bible retrieved from the Bounty, and had been so affected by what he'd read that he'd repented of his sins and embraced Christianity. The captain was very impressed, and he reported that Pitcairn was the world's most pious and perfect community. And all of the other ships that visited subsequently, now that the island had been rediscovered, came to the same conclusion. Very quickly, this amazing story of an island of reformed sinners spread across the English-speaking world. To outsiders, Pitcairn appeared to be an idyllic place, an ideal society, a little utopia. And the island's colourful history and its exotic location only added to its allure. the Pitcairners received a stream of gifts from well-wishers, including Queen Victoria. Then, in 1876, they converted en masse to Seventh-day Adventism. The American-based church was delighted by this coup, and from then on, and until very recently, it promoted Pitcairn throughout the world as a model Christian community. And that was how the island was seen throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, even by non-believers. For as the rest of the world shrank thanks to jet travel, Pitcairn remained tantalizingly inaccessible. Many people projected their escapist fantasies onto it, and although it was hard to get to, it attracted all sorts of visitors. Sailors, adventurers, historians, anthropologists, filmmakers. The Pitcairners made a very good living out of this fascination with their island, particularly from their souvenirs, wooden carvings that they'd made and sold to the visitors. And of course, those 5 Hollywood films helped to cement the Pitcairn myth. Then, in about 2000, the stories of rape and child abuse began filtering out. Now, the abuse of children is something that almost always evokes very strong reactions. Some convicted paedophiles get rocks thrown at their windows. Others are driven out of their street by angry neighbours. This is a crime that's seen as absolutely unacceptable. But in the Pitcairn case, the reactions were different. When the first reports appeared, a number of influential outsiders urged people not to condemn the men. They said Pitcairn was a South Pacific island, and like the rest of Polynesia, it had a tradition of underage sex. And the same argument was put very forcefully by certain Pitcairners, who claimed that the prosecution was a British plot to kill off the community. These islanders, and they included women, accused the so-called victims of leading the men on and of fabricating their allegations for money. This propaganda campaign, as I've called it in my book, was phenomenally successful. All sorts of people, lawyers, journalists, academics, were convinced by it and added their own voices. During the run-up to the court case, which took years to organise, the media reports, almost unfailingly, spoke of a Polynesian culture of underage sex and a plot by the big bad colonial power to close down poor little Pitcairn. As a result, many people believed that the case was a miscarriage of justice, and that the victims were not the women who were poised to give evidence, but rather the Pitcairn men themselves. The Pitcairn myth was so potent that many outsiders refused to believe that anything bad had gone on there, and that attitude didn't change even when the trials began, and it became clear that the case was not about youthful experimentation, it was about hardcore sexual abuse. Attacks on girls as young as 5 and 7, and one 10-year-old who was gagged and assaulted by 2 brothers. They took turns to hold her down and rape her. Just how strong and enduring the Pitcairn myth is became clear to me when I was on the island. During the court case, when several trials were in mid-flow, a cruise ship full of elderly Americans visited. Now, Pitcairn receives visits from such ships during the summer. They stop off for the day on their way to Tahiti or Easter Island, and the passengers get to meet the mutineers' descendants and visit historical landmarks such as Christian's Cave, where apparently Fletcher Christian used to watch out for British naval ships. For many people, apparently, it's the highlight of their cruise, and some book their trip for that sole purpose. But I was very surprised when I heard that this particular ship, the Clipper Odyssey, would be coming. I mean, half the adult men on the island, including the mayor, Steve Christian, were on trial. It seemed curious to me, the idea of tourists coming ashore and mingling with the accused men and their families. And I wondered, wasn't this whole child abuse business just, a little bit off-putting? I'm now going to read you a brief excerpt from my book about the Clipper Odyssey's visit. It was a strange day, and it began with a stranger taking a photograph of me as I folded a pile of clothes in my bedroom. Stepping outside, I discovered that Adamstown, the village, where the pace of life is usually languid, to say the least, was a hubbub of activity. Stalls had been set up in the square and along the main road, with souvenirs laid out under waterproof tarpaulins, There were Pitcairn stamps, postcards, T-shirts, cookbooks, woven baskets, local honey, and the ubiquitous wooden carvings. From the crest of the Hill of Difficulty, which leads up to Adamstown from Bounty Bay, I could see the Clipper Odyssey pitching quite briskly about a kilometre offshore. The two longboats were ferrying people to and fro, with the swell lifting their prows right out of the water and dashing them down again. Visitors with backpacks and sun hats and cameras were squelching their way along Pitcairn's muddy trails, while others were being shown around the island on quad bikes. A stout-hearted group was hiking up to Christine's Cave. At the landing where the boats dock, yet more stalls had been set up, and tourists were milling around, chatting excitedly with the locals. "What generation Pitcairner are you?" a middle-aged woman inquired as I stood on the jetty surveying the scene. "I'm not a Pitcairner," I replied. "But you work on the boats." "No," I said, "I'm a journalist." "Oh, so what are you doing on Pitcairn then?" "I'm covering the trials, you know, the child sexual abuse trials." "I see," backing off. "That must be interesting." At midday, the visitors converged on Steve Christian's house, Big Fence, for fish and chips, provided for a fee by Steve and his wife Olive. No one found the choice of lunch venue untoward, it seems, including the American tour company chartering the Clipper Odyssey. It was as if reality had been suspended and everyone was engaged in a game of make-believe. Let's make believe that everything is rosy on the legendary island of Bounty fame. Let's make believe that the Pitcairn Islanders are all fine, upstanding citizens. Let's make believe that half of the mutineers' male heirs, including our lunch hosts, aren't accused of sex crimes. More chips, anyone? Some of the ship's passengers quizzed us in hushed tones about the case. They appeared to be enjoying the extra frisson. One Belgian woman said, "We have exactly the same trials in our country not so long ago, so you can understand that happens everywhere." True, but it's not everywhere that crowds of tourists happily rub shoulders with alleged paedophiles, visit them in their homes, buy their souvenirs, pose for photographs with them, and treat them like nobility. An American man in his early 60s told me that he'd been longing to visit Pitcairn since he was a boy. "So how did it feel to be here at last?" "Awesome," he replied. Well, maybe some of those tourists hadn't read the media reports, but the same can't be said for newspaper columnists. In the London Times, Ross Clarke attacked Britain for treating a genuine example of cultural diversity as perversion. In the New Zealand Herald, Garth George scoffed at a headline that made reference to the men's lack of remorse. Why on earth would there be any remorse over what had obviously been part of Pitcairn culture since the place was settled, he asked. Colleen McCulloch, the best-selling novelist, who is married to a Norfolk Islander of Pitcairn descent, also weighed in. McCulloch told an interviewer that the British government's treatment of the Pitcairners was an absolute disgrace. She said, "These are indigenous customs and they should not be touched. It's Polynesian to break your girls in at 12, she said. When I got back from Pitcairn, certain friends and colleagues, to my surprise, expressed similar views. One friend said to me, "But it was cultural, wasn't it? I mean, it was part of their culture and everyone accepted it, even the women. And they weren't actually children. They were 12 or 13. That's the age when girls get married off in some countries." About 6 months after the trials, I went to England, and while I was there, I attended a meeting of the Pitcairn Islands Study Group. This is a group that was started by stamp collectors, but now welcomes anyone with an interest in Pitcairn and the Bounty. What struck me about this gathering of well-meaning eccentrics was that during the entire day they spent together, the subject of the recent criminal case was never mentioned. And when I raised it with one leading member of the group over morning tea, she replied, "Those beastly trials, my prayers have been with the men." At one point, the group's honorary secretary made a public announcement of a happy event, the recent birth of a baby boy to Randy Christian, the mayor's son. Everyone clapped, and I just sat there thinking, surely they know that Randy's just been found guilty of serial child rape. The Pitcairn myth is carefully cultivated by the islanders. They've always had a reputation for being charming to outsiders, particularly to tourists, and also to the crews of passing ships, who sometimes donate supplies to the island. The islanders even have their own term for this, hypocriting the stranger. And I saw it in action when the Clipper Odyssey visited, and the Pitcairners, who'd been scowling at me for weeks, were suddenly all smiles. The smiles were for the passengers, but they put on their public faces, and so just for that day, they smiled at me as well. It struck me when I was on the island that the Pitcairners have become so accustomed to being actors in their own drama that they've actually bought into their own myth. They talk about Fletcher Christian as if he was alive just the other day, and they all wear T-shirts with a Pitcairn or Bounty logo. These are T-shirts that they manufacture to sell to tourists, but they wear them themselves even when no one's around. It's almost like their national costume. One of the people I met at the Pitcairn Islands study group was Maurice Allwood, a man in his early 80s, very dapper. He invited me to his home, where he and his wife Joy told me about the parties that they hold on Bounty Day. That's the anniversary of the burning of the ship by the mutineers off the Pitcairn coast. On the island, the sailors' descendants marked that day by torching a replica of the ship in their little cove, Bounty Bay. Maurice did the same. He built a model of the Bounty and set fire to it on the back patio of his suburban brick cottage in Hatfield, north of London. He and his guests sang Pitcairn songs and dressed up as mutineers and ate Pitcairn dishes such as breadfruit fritters. And he'd recently celebrated Bounty Day in this way, although he knew all about the trials and even showed me a collection of newspaper cuttings. I came to realise that there are people like Maurice all over the world, people who are fascinated by everything concerning Pitcairn and the Bounty. These die-hard Pitcairn fans haunt the big auction houses, where they bid for obscure relics and memorabilia. Maurice owns a fragment of the Bounty's rudder and a shard of rock from Christian's cave. They subscribe to the Miscellany, Pitcairn's newspaper, and pay for the islanders to come and visit them in America or Japan. And they congregate in online chat rooms, where they debate Pitcairn's history and exchange news about the mundane doings of its residents. I dipped into the main chat room, which is called Friends of Pitcairn. Had I known nothing else about the island, I would have come away with the impression of a gentle, whimsical community, full of stalwart men and women struggling to survive against the odds. The friends debated questions such as, do Pitcairners have washing machines? And whatever happened to Fletcher Christian? They cooed over photographs of children on Pitcairn and dispatched birthday greetings to elderly islanders. When the child abuse scandal broke, they deplored the bad publicity that followed and blamed it all on ignorant and ill-disposed journalists. In fact, when I came back from the island, I noticed a post stating that Kathy Marks, for one, should be shot. But despite the bad publicity, the island continued to win new converts, such as one Swedish man who joined the chat room explaining, I thought it would be both interesting and fun to get to know and learn about how the daily life is today on this special and so mythical island. The myth, it's clear, is stronger than the reality. One of the things that has helped to create the Pitcairn myth is the island's extreme remoteness. Now, there are places geographically more isolated than Pitcairn, but there's nowhere else that is quite so difficult to get to. This is an island that in 2008 has no airstrip and no safe harbour, or even a regular boat service. To get there, you have to hitch a lift on one of the big container ships passing through the South Pacific, or as I do, you have to fly to a very distant part of French Polynesia and then embark on a rough 30-hour boat voyage. Even when you get to Pitcairn, you're not there yet. You have to anchor offshore and wait for the island men to bring out their longboats and collect you. And when I arrived, I was astonished to see that the two men driving the longboat were two of the men who would shortly be going on trial for very serious child sex offences. And I think it was at that point that I realised how unusual this assignment was going to be. Once you've made that gruelling journey and landed on Pitcairn, you can't get off, not until the next ship passes, and that could be months away. You're stuck on this lump of rock, with everyone living in very close proximity in one small community. There were no telephones when I was there, no television. Even shortwave radio reception was patchy. And the living conditions, I think, reinforce how far from so-called civilization you are. There's no sewerage system. The electricity's only on for 10 hours a day. And if you want hot water, well, you have to chop wood and build a fire. And from early on, I was struck by a quite oppressive sense of isolation. I remember standing on the summit of the island with 360-degree views and an empty horizon in every direction. And I had this very powerful sense at that moment of how the girls were literally trapped on Pitcairn. Because of their remoteness, the Pitcairners are completely dependent on passing ships. All their supplies arrive by ship, and ships are their only way of getting on and off the island. Every time that a ship looms up on the horizon, everything on Pitcairn comes to a halt. I read about an occasion in the 1950s when a vessel was spotted while a wedding was taking place. Within minutes, everyone, including the bride and groom still in their finery, was down at the jetty and launching the longboat. More recently, a ship was sighted by islanders gathered for the funeral of an elderly woman. All the men, including the woman's son, took off while her coffin was still being lowered into the ground. When supply ships arrive, they stop a mile or so offshore, and the men take the longboat out to meet them. The little boat anchors next to the massive container ship, and the 40-gallon fuel drums and huge pieces of timber are lowered into the boat in a cargo net. And this can happen at night or in extremely foul weather. There's often huge seas around Pitcairn, so it's very dangerous work. And every time the longboat lands at Bounty Bay, which is very narrow and rocky, there's a risk of it ending up on the rocks. So boat handling skills and muscle power are absolutely vital on Pitcairn. And it's the men who have traditionally carried out such jobs. This is a community that depends on its men to survive. Pitcairn, as you may have gathered, is not a stereotypical South Pacific island. It's very rugged. Quite a number of people have died falling off cliffs or been swept off the rocks by freak waves while fishing. So the Pitcairn men regularly carry out rescues at sea of their fellow islanders or of ships that have got into trouble. And these undoubtedly courageous acts have added to the men's heroic aura. I heard a story about Steve Christian. He's the former mayor and longtime community leader who was convicted of 5 rapes in 2004. The islanders were heading home from a ship in very rough seas, and the longboat's propeller got caught in a rope. Steve dived overboard, cut the rope, and was back in the boat before most people had realized that anything was amiss. But it's not just individuals who play a key role. The community cannot function unless everybody works together. And that struck me very strongly the day after the verdicts in the court case. I was down at the jetty watching the men who'd just been out to visit a ship, unloading the longboat together. I noticed that working together, shoulder to shoulder, were men who'd just been found guilty and the men whose daughters they'd raped and assaulted. This is another occasion of the men unloading. That's the way life is there. Everyone has to cooperate. You might despise someone, but you can't afford to be openly hostile. I was told about 2 men who dislike each other intensely, apparently. One of them discovered that his papaya trees had been poisoned. He felt sure this other man was responsible, but he never confronted him. He just boiled silently. Now, can I just remind you how small the Pitcairn population is? At its height in the 1930s, it reached 230, but over the past 40 years, it's dropped to 50 to 60 people. When you've got that degree of interdependence in such a tiny community, the pressure to conform is very intense. If you criticize the way things are done or step out of line in some way, life can be very unpleasant. I mean, imagine being sent to Coventry in such an isolated place. And there might be material repercussions. You might find that the supplies that you ordered from New Zealand, for some reason, don't end up getting to shore. So how does such a society operate? Well, in Pitcairn's case, it was very hierarchical. The most able men were at the top of the pecking order. Then came the weaker men. Below them were the women, and right at the bottom were the island's children. It was the most powerful men who ran the community, and in recent times that meant Steve Christian and his sons, and his close friends and allies. This small group of men controlled every aspect of life. They were the only ones who were allowed to drive the longboat. They were the only ones who were allowed to use the tractor. And they got first pick of the young girls growing up on the island. But sexual abuse was only one of the ways in which the Pitcairn men exercised their power. It was just one manifestation of a bullying mentality that seems to pervade the whole community. Domestic violence is another that's always been part of life on Pitcairn, reportedly. And the stronger men bully the weaker ones, and some parents bully their children, and that's how life is in this little community that's been left to itself. Left to itself because, although Pitcairn is a British colony, the British never took much interest in the place. The governor, who was based in Fiji and later in New Zealand, visited only very occasionally. Otherwise, Britain was content to let the island run its own affairs. The locals appointed their own community leaders and police officers and magistrates, and the policeman was related to everyone else on the island, and the magistrate was related to everyone else. And so, not surprisingly, very few court cases were held. There was a little prison on Pitcairn, but it was rarely occupied, and in the last few decades it was used to store life jackets. This was a society with no external constraints, and no internal rule of law either. So the Pitcairners were able to make up their own rules, and as it happened, it was the most powerful men who made up the rules. One question I've posed in my book is whether the situation that's come to light on Pitcairn was inevitable. You probably all know the story of Lord of the Flies, a group of English schoolboys left alone on a Pacific island, and how quickly they descend into savagery and violence. Was Pitcairn a bit like Lord of the Flies? One of the attractions of the island for the men who lived there was the freedom to do whatever they wanted, particularly when it came to sexual behaviour. There were no sexual boundaries on Pitcairn. It's worth noting that none of these men offended while they were living overseas, only when they were on the island. It's almost as if that freedom went to people's heads. One of the men told police when he was interviewed, "Being in a place like that, you get rock fever and you don't tend to think too straight. It's almost like something else is taking control of you." Another man described Pitcairn as a place where it's difficult to be good. And the climate was infectious. Several outsiders joined in the abuse, including, allegedly, a New Zealand teacher. What I think now, after researching this book, is that small, isolated societies are inherently unhealthy. You're likely to get the very crude power dynamics that developed on Pitcairn, and it's easy for one or two strong individuals to shape the culture and for aberrant behaviour to become the norm. And this is a rather depressing thought, but we all have the capacity to behave badly. And much as we like to think that we're very principled and moral beings, perhaps the only thing that prevents us from behaving badly is the social and legal constraints that were completely absent on Pitcairn. One of the questions that troubled me following the trials was, why was the child abuse hidden for so long? Pitcairn may have been isolated, but it was a British colony, so it's fair to ask the question, didn't Britain know what was going on? I've already mentioned that British officials visited very infrequently, and the fact is there was never a resident administrator on Pitcairn. But that didn't mean that there was no contact between the island and the colonial authorities. On the contrary, there was a great deal of communication, and what Britain was repeatedly told was that all was not well in its distant colony. In the 1950s, teachers warned Britain about schoolgirls falling pregnant as a result of interference by grown men, and about a 10-year-old who'd been raped so violently by a member of a leading island family that she suffered physical injuries. And in the decades that followed, there were reports of other rapes, and of girls being broken in by older men as a matter of custom. Britain also saw the island's birth records, which showed that most women had their first baby between the ages of 12 and 15. And it was told of an incident where a schoolgirl died in childbirth because the baby was too big for her. So there was a lot of disturbing information reaching British officials, the things I've just mentioned, and also instances of very brutal domestic violence, including a woman allegedly murdered by her husband. But for some reason, British officials never acted on this information. They didn't follow up the reports, find out whether the alleged rapes and murders had been investigated properly, or even so much as pass comment on being informed about such incidents. When the first formal allegations came to light in 2000, this was the reaction of the then Governor Martin Williams. He wrote, "I have no doubt that these are not unique cases. It is far more likely that they are a continuation of a pattern that has been going on for 200 years. I think Britain over the years didn't want to know about this stuff. It was too hard, even in recent eras when sexual abuse, child abuse was no longer a taboo subject. And perhaps the island's administrators just thought, well, the girls on Pitcairn are promiscuous, and the Pitcairners are just a bunch of natives with loose morals. We can't expect them to behave any better." The islanders, though, weren't left entirely on their own. For most of the 20th century, they had a teacher living among them, and also a Seventh-day Adventist church minister. These outsiders were sent out from New Zealand or Australia, and each one stayed for about 2 years. They lived at the heart of the community, got to know the island as well, and probably knew more than anyone else about how the place functioned. Some of these people were interviewed during the police investigation, and I spoke to some of them myself later on. Quite a number of them said that they'd known children were being abused, or at the very least had had strong suspicions. Yet not one of them reported any of this to the authorities, either while they were on the island or when they got home. What they did do, these teachers and religious leaders, was they made sure to keep their own daughters safe. They warned each other about the dangers. One teacher sent his daughter home. Another gave his daughter a list of island men whom, he said, she was never to be alone with. I asked them why they hadn't spoken up at the time. Several said, well, we had no proof. One told me, if a child comes to you in New Zealand and says this is happening to me, then you go and do something about it. But on Pitcairn, I mean, looking back on it, it just seemed to be a fact of life. I didn't get involved in any of that. I just did my job and minded my own business. The wife of another teacher said to me, well, that's Pitcairn Island, that's their life, that's the way they want to be. The Adventist pastors also turned a blind eye and even actively covered up the abuse. One girl who'd been raped went to the pastor for help. He told her that it was all her fault and she must never tell anyone else about it. She never did, and as a result of this rape, she was never able to have children. The mother of a 9-year-old who'd been raped told the minister's wife, but nothing was done, and the girl was raped again, and the same man also attacked her younger sister. Now, when the investigation started, in more recent times, there was a lay pastor on Pitcairn, a practicing Seventh-day Adventist from Australia. This man has been one of the most outspoken defenders of the Pitcairn men. In fact, he and his wife, and his mother-in-law too, sent me some rather nasty emails when I got back from Pitcairn. Sensationalist garbage and lies was how they described my reporting. And they said to me basically, what's your problem? Perhaps you've been abused yourself and you want to make every man pay. One reason why outsiders failed to speak up was they didn't want to destroy Pitcairn's romantic cachet. And some of them were affected by a syndrome that's been described as Pitcairn fever. This happens to many outsiders. They go to the island, they spend long periods there, and they become intoxicated with the place and the people. Their normal value system is turned upside down, and the infatuation with Pitcairn continues even after they leave. When the prosecution began, 11 teachers wrote a letter to the British governor attacking the legal process, and 2 of them actually plotted to undermine the police investigation, although one of them had told his family that, I have no doubt the guys are guilty as sin, and the sexual abuse has been going on from the time of the bounty. I spoke to one pastor who'd spent 4 years on Pitcairn during the early 1990s. I asked him why he hadn't reported what he found out then about life on the island. He said to me, hindsight's a great teacher. And I wonder whether all of us, the outsiders, were a symptom of the same thing. I wonder whether everyone was caught up in the Pitcairn myth. So Britain didn't help the girls on Pitcairn, and the teachers didn't help the girls, and the pastors didn't help the girls either. What about their parents, though? I mean, protecting one's young is one of the most fundamental human instincts. On Pitcairn, parents didn't protect their children, although everyone on the island knew exactly what was going on. They didn't make a fuss, confront their daughter's abusers, or make any kind of official complaint. They kept silent, and when the scandal finally broke, most of them supported the offenders rather than the victims. Not long after I arrived on Pitcairn, the journalists were invited to a meeting of the island's women. It took place at Big Fence, Olive Christian's house. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from my book which gives a bit of a flavour of this meeting. We had been summoned to Big Fence, it turned out, to be told that the men were not perverts or hardened criminals. They were decent, hard-working family types. No islander would tolerate children being interfered with, and no one on Pitcairn had ever been raped. The victims were girls who'd known exactly what they were doing. It was they who had thrown themselves at the men. The talkative women at the meeting explained to us that underage sex was the norm on Pitcairn. Darylyn Warren, the daughter of Jay Warren, one of the defendants, told us in a matter-of-fact way that she had lost her virginity at 13, and I felt shit hot about it too. I felt like a big lady. She was partly boasting, partly censorious of her younger self, it seemed to me. Others clamoured to make similar admissions. I had it at 12 and I was shit hot too, said Jay's sister Meralda, a woman in her 40s. Darylyn's mother Carol, 54 years old, agreed that 13 was the normal age, adding, I used to be a wild thing when I was young and single. Olive Christian described her youth with evident nostalgia as a time when we all thought sex was like food on the table. We must have looked surprised. They were surprised we were surprised. Well, at what age did we start having sex, they demanded. It was clear in this company and at this particular juncture that the question could not be avoided. Some of our responses met with howls of derision. The women of Pitcairn did not believe that anyone could have lost their virginity at 18. The idea of being that old was simply preposterous. The serious point of this was to persuade us that the criminal case was based on a misconception, and furthermore, that it was all part of an elaborate plot. Britain was determined to close the island down, they said, because it had become a financial burden, a thorn in the arse, as Tanya Christian, Stephen Olive's daughter, put it. What better way to achieve that than to jail the men who were the very backbone of the community? Why, though, we wondered aloud, would the women who had spoken to police have fabricated their accounts that, despite them growing up on the island in different eras and now living thousands of kilometres apart, were remarkably alike? At this point, the Pitcairners produced their trump card, Carol Warren's daughters, Darylyn and Charlene. Charlene, 25 years old, with long curly hair and a diffident manner, spoke up first, egged on by her mother. Charlene revealed that she had been one of the women who made a statement in 2000 alleging sexual abuse by Pitcairn men. But, she added, as others around her clucked approvingly, she had only done so because she had been blinded by greed. She explained, "The detectives dragged me to the police station. I didn't know what I had done. I was ignorant. I was offered good money for each person I could name. They said I would get something like $4,000 for every guy. After I had added it up in my head, I was like, whoa, I just blurted everything out to them." Then it was her sister's turn. Darylyn was 27, well-built with a fair complexion. She resembled Charlene physically, but was more self-assured. Darylyn told us that she'd also made a statement, but only, she said, after being browbeaten by police. She claimed that detectives had asked her to make up a false allegation against a guy here because they didn't have enough evidence to put him under. Both sisters were living in New Zealand at the time of the investigation, and both told police that they were prepared to go to court. But after I really thought about it, it was half and half. I wanted it just as bad as them. It was very much a mutual thing, said Charlene, referring to the men whom she had named as abusers. That re-evaluation took place after Charlene returned to Pitcairn. Darylyn changed her mind shortly before she too went home. By now my head was spinning. We had had middle-aged matrons bragging about their sexual exploits. We'd had Charlene and Darylyn outing themselves as victims, but not really victims. Now their mother Carol was declaring that no Pitcairn girl had ever been abused, and almost in the same breath telling us that she had had an unpleasant experience as a child. It didn't affect me, she said. I was probably luckier than some I've read about. It was tried, but nothing happened. I was 10 at the time, but even at 10 I knew it was wrong. It's a bad thing. I screamed like hell. When she heard that her daughter Darylyn had spoken to police, Carol said, I thought, what on earth is that girl thinking about, the silly idiot? Well, if that's what she's gone and done, I'll have to stand by her. She went on, I told the cops not one of these girls went into this with their eyes shut. They knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't forced by anyone. The women here are loose and it's not the men's fault. What are they supposed to do? Carol then hinted at some really bad stuff that I know about that's happened on the island that's a heck of a lot worse than underage sex. That's sick sex I'm talking about between adults. She was referring to adultery, it transpired, and as she uttered the word, Carol growled like an alley cat. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but to me that's taboo, she said. Some people don't care. They don't have morals. After this meeting, I felt rather confused, but as time went on, I came to realize that these were women who'd been victims themselves, and who spent decades trying to forget about it. In fact, when the police investigation started, some of these women reportedly said, what's the fuss? We all went through it. It's part of life on Pitcairn. But publicly, they denied the existence of sexual abuse, and so their only option was to defend the men. This is some of the women at the Big Fence meeting I've just been reading about. Besides, at the time when these women's daughters were being abused, it would have been incredibly difficult for them to do anything about it. Who do you tell? The people in positions of authority, police officers, magistrates, etc., were abusing too. And everyone on Pitcairn was related. This was a claustrophobically close-knit community, rather like a large extended family. Are you going to dob in a relative or neighbour? And just imagine how awkward it would be in such a tiny isolated place if people were to start making accusations. Moreover, everyone was at it, either offending themselves or tolerating it going on around them. Suppose you were to point the finger. Someone else might accuse your husband or brother or father or son. One woman I've heard about did make a fuss. Her daughter had been raped and she found some evidence. And she took it down to a meeting of the Island Council and brandished it in front of everyone. And the men turned their backs on her. And from that moment on, she and her family were ostracized. That's a very rare example of a parent protesting. Most parents felt impotent. I was told about a father who realized that a particular man was interested in his daughters. He offered the man some of his wooden carvings to sell, if only he would promise to stay away from them. Some parents, it seemed, didn't actually mind. On Pitcairn, towards the end of my stay, I saw two of the island men out fishing together. One had just been convicted of raping a girl. With him in the boat was that girl's father. This skewed morality is characteristic of Pitcairn. The 15-year-old, for instance, who blew the whistle, she had to leave the island for her own safety and has never been back, never will be able to. She's been cut off by the community and even by her own family. Her father tried to bully her out of going to court. Her mother actually gave evidence against her. She withstood the pressure, but other women gave way. More than a dozen withdrew from the case. They'd been warned that otherwise they'd never be welcome on Pitcairn again. And if the community collapsed, it would be all their fault. I've talked about the community's interdependence, and I think that's one reason why the islanders are willing to make quite drastic moral compromises that perhaps you and I couldn't contemplate. But there's another factor that helps to explain why parents didn't stand up for their children, and that's the very strong, almost pathological attachment and loyalty that the Pitcairners have for their island. It's something that struck me when I was there, and I think it goes beyond the natural fondness for home. And I believe that in some cases, perhaps many cases, adults put the community before their own children, sacrifice their daughters effectively, so as not to harm the island. and also so that they would be able to carry on living there. Because, you know, everyone had the right to live and work in New Zealand. They didn't have to stay on Pitcairn. But it's a very nice lifestyle, and it's a very good income. And you've got that almost unlimited freedom. To me, one of the things that the Pitcairn case demonstrates, quite chillingly, is the way that people can be complicit just by remaining silent. And I'm reminded of that quote by Edmund Burke, the 18th century philosopher, who said, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." So you had a Pitcairn myth that was stronger than the reality, and you had an incredibly remote place where men were kings, and you had parents who colluded by not speaking up, and outsiders who became sucked into the whole Pitcairn thing. I think that Pitcairn raises some very dark questions about human nature. It was a Lord of the Flies situation, and what went on there reminds us how fragile is the human behaviour that we call civilised. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. If there are questions, I've got a microphone here, so just put up your hand and we'll take some questions.
The way of life you're describing on Pitcairn, where the system of government they had, where you've got the most respected men in charge, and then the men and then the women and so forth, it's kind of what like anthropologists call big man government. I think that's the right term. It's kind of the way a troop of baboons is run, you know. How much of what happened on Pitcairn, of the way people ran things on Pitcairn, do you think is essentially just the way humans naturally run things when they're in very small communities? And how much of it required that isolation, required the interdependence as well to make it happen?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you just said.
Okay. I mean...
The second bit about how much?
Yeah, how much of it required... I mean, there are a few interesting features of Pitcairn. I mean, one is that you've got these very small group of people who aren't part of a larger community or don't see themselves as part of a larger community. And the other thing is that they're very isolated and they're very interdependent. How much the result you got of this sort of big man government happening on Pitcairn, how much of that is just because that's the way humans naturally are, and how much of it do you think depends on the unique characteristics of Pitcairn? That's probably a bit vague. Answer it.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think one of the interesting things you've raised is the fact that it was a community that grew up with no external point of reference, which I think is really unusual. You know, there are other small, isolated communities, you know, around Australia or islands around the world, but just about everyone has got a link with a wider network of communities. I mean, in my book I've talked about the Orkney Islands, you know, very isolated islands off the north of Scotland, but they've got this link with each other. They've got a ferry service, they've got the connection with Scotland and with the UK. Now, Pitcairn's only connection was with Norfolk Island, where the Pitcairners all migrated in the mid-19th century, and most of them stayed, and, you know, many Norfolk Islanders have got that Pitcairn descent. A few people went back to Pitcairn, and that's the origins of the community today. So connection with Norfolk Island and also a connection with New Zealand, where there's a large expatriate population. But these places are thousands of kilometres away. I mean, you know, for most of Pitcairn's existence, it was just on its own. And I think that is probably one thing that makes it, if not unique, then very unusual. The big man government, I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but I mean, it seems to me that when you do get a small place, you know, it's a kind of animal thing, you know, the survival of the fittest and the biggest, most powerful men are in control. I mean, I don't think there's any kind of mystery about that. Does that answer your question?
I can understand the circling of the wagons of the people on the island because of the interdependent relationships going through. So to some extent you can kind of see why they held outsiders out of any sort of debate about what was going on. But what sort of response have you had coming back to Australia or the UK from people? You've alluded to the Pitcairn support group in the UK not wanting to know about the abuse. What about people who don't actually have any real relationship with Pitcairn? Have you had a range of positive or negative responses from the public?
Well, maybe people only communicate when they've got negative things to say, but I'd say that I've probably only had the kind of negative responses that I've alluded to in my talk, with people basically saying, you know, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know the island, I've spent years there myself, or, you know, I've had contact with the islanders for many decades, and I can tell you that they're very fine, upstanding people, and I think, I've had some feedback both from the wider Pitcairn expatriate community and also from some of the kind of people I've referred to in this talk, Pitcairn groupies, for want of a more polite word. And, you know, people understandably were not very happy about this stuff coming out. It's very unpleasant. It doesn't do wonders for Pitcairn's image. And this is a place that lives off its image, you know, that Pitcairn would collapse economically if there wasn't the fascination with the place and the belief in this romantic aura.
I'm also thinking about wider than people who have any sort of relationship or knowledge of Pitcairn. The fact that trial judges were brought in from the UK and yet the men were given incredibly short sentences.
Yeah, the judges and lawyers were New Zealanders, so the legal personnel all came in from New Zealand. I think it's a matter of convenience. That's where the British diplomats who are responsible for Pitcairn are based in New Zealand. You mentioned about the sentences. They were, by any yardstick, very lenient sentences. I mean, I've talked about the seriousness of the kind of offending and the numbers of rapes that were committed, 4, 5, 6, and quite a few of them were just specimen offences, you know, covering a multitude of incidents. The sentences ranged from 2 to 6.5 years. And they have been served in that little prison I mentioned on Pitcairn, which is quite a nice place, actually. You know, it's a new building with wooden timber floors and ensuite bathrooms and stuff. And most of the men are actually out of prison already because they can apply for parole after a third of their terms. I talked a bit about Steve Christian. I think he was convicted of 5 rapes. He served 9 months in prison. And was then on home detention, and while on home detention was able to run a cafe with his wife Olive and serve on a government committee reviewing Pitcairn's future. So I think some of the women I've spoken to who are victims in this case don't feel that it was a real punishment, the sentences, and they feel that it's been a bit of a slap on the wrist, and what kind of deterrent is there to other people looking at committing this kind of offences?
I'm just interested. Is it on? What's the future then? I mean, will anything change, or, you know, will the islanders just be more careful, or, you know, or is there any fundamental possibility for a change in mindset, you know, on Pitcairn Island, given that all the men got was a slap on the wrist, which they're out now and they've gone back to their supposedly respectable lives?
Yeah, there are 3 men still in prison, but they're due to be out fairly soon. I mean, none of those men, with perhaps one exception, have really expressed any remorse. There's no sign of them acknowledging that they did anything wrong, and I think that's the case in the wider community as well. There's still this kind of communal denial going on, whether that's just for public consumption, whether behind the scenes people are actually examining themselves and, you know, remembering what happened to them or what they did and acknowledging a bit of reality, I don't know, but certainly publicly there's no sign that mindsets have changed. And so, you know, I think a community where children have been abused for maybe 7 or 8 or 9 generations, it's very hard for it to change. If it does do, it will take a very long time. And I mean, otherwise, in terms of a material future, the prospects are actually, ironically, looking better than they ever have done, because as a result of this case, which caused the British great embarrassment, they're putting a massive amount of money into the island, 50 million New Zealand dollars at the last count, to improve infrastructure and give the islanders televisions and a telephone system and sealed roads and a new harbour all sorts of nice things. And also trying to rebuild it, sort of build a new economy based on ecotourism. So you've got all this activity going on, all this money going in, and all this kind of this frenzy of, you know, how to build a future for Pitcairn and also attract people to live there so that there's a bigger community which would be more healthy. But at the same time, there's no real acknowledgement of the momentous things that have come to light in recent years and of them being dealt with. I don't know about that.
Kathy, the islanders obviously had their own moral code, but at the same time you said they were members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which of course I think doesn't condone this kind of behaviour. So would you describe them as being particularly religious? Do they go to church regularly? And if so, what kinds of messages do they get through the church?
I think that they, in the past, were very observant. They certainly went to church every Sunday and prayer meetings in the week and observed all the Adventist churches' rules, such as not to smoke and drink alcohol and so on, at least sort of in public. But obviously, and you know, as I mentioned, they had this reputation of being very model, you know, of being a very Christian people, a model community. But obviously in the background, they were behaving in a terrible way towards the most vulnerable members of that community, the children, and either doing it or condoning it. That's not a very Christian way to behave, I don't think. You talked about them having their own moral code. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that the Pitcairners, although they've been isolated, and I've obviously talked about that, there was a lot of contact with the outside world. There were always outsiders visiting, and the Pitcairners, for at least the past century, have been travelling back and forth to New Zealand and further afield frequently, and even spending extended periods living there. That's the case with some of the men who were convicted. So I think that they undoubtedly became aware, if they needed to be told, of the moral standards and norms of the outside world. And they knew very well that what they were doing was wrong, but they just went on doing it because they could. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to talk about different moral standards. I think that's, you know, I don't really go along with that idea. But, and I think the Christianity thing was a sham. I think it was just, it was all superficial.
Kathy, I was just wondering if any children were removed from Pitcairn as a result of the convictions of the men, or if that sort of thing was ever talked about, because surely in a community such as the UK, that's the first thing that might happen.
No, because by the time the allegations came to light, there weren't many children on Pitcairn. The custom was that when kids reached the age of 15, they went to New Zealand to finish their schooling. And then, you know, they'd do whatever they wanted, which might include coming back to live on Pitcairn. As it happened, most girls didn't go back, not surprisingly. So you didn't have girls going back, you didn't have women having children there, and so that's one reason the population was shrinking so drastically. And in fact, you know, if you look at the current population, there's a whole couple of generations of women missing, or a whole age group really, between about 20 and 50. So there were just a few children who were on the island, and social workers were sent out and are still there, keeping an eye on them. And the other interesting thing is, although there wasn't an issue of removing children, I know that social workers and people who deal with, professionals who deal with child sex offenders were horrified that these men remained on bail for all those years, because it took about 5 years for the case to go to court, and even then there were legal appeals and so on that meant that they were basically just walking around their own community at liberty for 6 or 7 years. And there, you know, there were children there, in some cases living with them. And I remember one person who works with convicted paedophiles said to me, it would never happen anywhere else. You know, the priority would be the children, and the men would be either put in prison or just removed from that community until they've gone to trial. And I think these people are also rather horrified about the short sentences and the fact that really it's not a very effective deterrent for young people growing up on Pitcairn today. Thank you. Thank you.